The strangest thing about the frontier wasn't how people died. It was how often the dead came back breathing. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Maybe some small town with dusty roads of its own. And if you still believe kindness matters out where the world turns cold, stay with me. Because this story began beneath 6 feet of Arizona dirt. The wind rolled low across the desert that night, dragging sand against the wooden fence posts around Silas Hale's ranch like dry bones rubbing together. 40 miles from the nearest town, nothing moved out there except coyotes and regret. Silas liked it that way. For 8 years, he had lived alone beneath that endless western sky, speaking more to horses than men. The war had taken enough from him to make silence feel safer than company. His cabin sat crooked beside a dying cottonwood tree, with one lantern burning weak against the dark. Most folks in Black Hollow said Silas Hale was half ghost already. Some claimed he buried bodies in the hills behind his ranch. Others swore they'd seen Apache riders watching his property at dawn. But people in frontier towns built stories the same way storms built dust clouds. Quietly, then all at once. That evening had started like any other. A shovel, a lantern, a patch of hard desert earth near the old fence line. Silas stood inside the shallow grave, sweat darkening the collar of his faded gray shirt despite the cold October air. The coffin beside him wasn't for a person he knew. At least not yet. Earlier that afternoon, he'd found it drifting near Dry Creek after heavy rain tore through the canyon north of town. Pine wood, fresh nails, no markings. Too small for a grown man, too heavy for a child. He should have left it there. A smarter man would have. But something about the box bothered him all through supper. Maybe it was the scrape marks along the lid. Maybe it was the strange smell of smoke clinging to the wood. Or maybe it was because lonely men notice things other people ignore. Silas pushed the shovel deeper into the dirt. The lantern beside him flickered hard as the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low. He wiped sweat from his jaw and looked toward the coffin again. The box sat half buried beside the grave like it didn't belong to the earth. His horse, Mercy, suddenly snorted near the fence and pulled nervously against the reins. Silas frowned. That horse had stood steady through blizzards and gunfire. It didn't scare easy. Then came the sound. Knock. Soft at first, barely louder than would settling in cold air. Silas froze. Another knock followed. Slower this time. From inside the coffin, the desert went completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas stared at the box while his hand drifted toward the revolver hanging low on his hip. Knock. Knock. A weak scraping sound followed. Not violent. Not angry. Human. He climbed from the grave slowly, boots crunching dry dirt beneath him. Every instinct told him to walk away. Frontier men learned early that some things buried in the desert were better left buried. But Silas had spent too many years haunted by the memory of people nobody bothered saving. He grabbed the crowbar leaning against the fence post and approached the coffin. The lantern light trembled across the wood. More scratching now. Fainter. Like whoever was inside was running out of strength. Silas slid the metal bar beneath the lid and pulled. The nails groaned loose one by one. Then the lid cracked open 3 inches. A hand burst through the gap. Small, covered in dirt and dried blood. Silas stumbled backward hard enough to nearly lose his footing. The fingers clawed weakly at the air before collapsing against the wood. Easy, he muttered under his breath, though his own heart hammered like hooves on stone. He forced the lid open wider. A young Apache woman lay inside wrapped in rough canvas blankets, her dark hair tangled with dust, her breathing shallow and uneven. Bruises marked one side of her face. Her wrists carried rope burns fresh enough to still be red beneath the dirt. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green, sharp, awake, watching him like a cornered wolf deciding whether he was predator or salvation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern hissed softly between them while desert wind pushed through the cottonwood. Branches overhead. Then she whispered something in Apache too weak for him to understand. Silas crouched beside the coffin carefully. "You're alive," he said quietly. Her lips trembled once before she answered in rough English. "Not if they come back." The words settled heavy in the cold air. Silas looked toward the empty horizon instinctively. Nothing but darkness and distant hills. Yet something in her voice made the night feel crowded suddenly. She tried to sit up but winced sharply, pressing one shaking hand against her ribs. That was when Silas noticed the folded paper clenched tightly in her other hand. Half-burned, edges black with ash. She saw him looking at it and tightened her grip immediately. Fear flashed across her face harder than pain. "Don't let them take this," she whispered. "Promise me." Silas didn't answer right away, because out on the frontier, promises had a way of dragging men into graves deeper than dirt. Silas Hale had spent 8 years avoiding trouble, and now trouble was sitting at his kitchen table wrapped in one of his blankets, staring at him over the flame of a kerosene lamp like she still was not sure whether he planned to help her or bury her again. Outside, the desert wind dragged across the ranch in long hollow whistles, rattling the loose boards on the barn roof. The cabin smelled of coffee, smoke, and rain drifting down from the northern hills. Silas set a dented tin cup beside the woman carefully. "Drink slow," he said. "You look like you have not eaten since Sunday." She hesitated before touching the cup. Her hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, though she tried hiding it. Silas noticed anyway. Men who lived alone noticed small things because silence left room for details. The Apache woman studied him over the steam rising from the coffee. Her green eyes looked strange in the lantern light. Not soft, not fearful, watchful, like someone who had survived too much to trust kindness quickly. She took one careful sip, then winced slightly as warmth hit her empty stomach. "What is your name?" Silas asked. She lowered the cup slowly. "Ayanna." The name settled into the room softly. Outside, Mercy stomped nervously in the stable again. Silas glanced toward the dark window. "You expecting company?" Ayanna did not answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the half-burned paper still clenched in her hand. The edges had blackened so badly the writing disappeared in places, but Silas could still see ink beneath the soot. Signatures. Official markings. Something important enough to kill over. "You should not have opened that coffin," she said quietly. "Probably true. Now they will come for you too." Silas leaned back in the wooden chair near the stove. "Funny thing about this place. Trouble usually finds me whether I invite it or not." A faint smile almost reached her lips before disappearing again. The silence stretched between them while rain finally began tapping against the cabin roof. Soft at first, then harder. Desert storms never arrived politely. Ayanna stared toward the fire, though Silas could tell her mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere darker. Somewhere she kept trying not to return to. "Who buried you?" he finally asked. Her jaw tightened immediately. "Men from Black Hollow." Silas frowned. "Town folk." She nodded once. "The sheriff told them I murdered the preacher." That made him still. Black Hollow only had one preacher. Reverend Matthew Doyle. Old man with silver hair and a limp from the war. Silas had not spoken to him in months, but the preacher once brought medicine to his ranch during a fever winter when nobody else bothered checking if he was alive. "Doyle is dead?" he asked quietly. Ayanna looked into the fire. 3 nights ago. Rain hammered harder against the roof now, and thunder rolled somewhere deep across the canyon country. Silas rubbed one rough hand across his jaw slowly. Nothing about Reverend Doyle dying made sense. The old preacher spent more time healing arguments than starting them. Black Hollow respected him. Some feared him too because Doyle knew things about people they preferred buried. "And the sheriff blamed you," Silas said. "Sheriff Wallace Grady saw me near the church." Her voice remained calm, but Silas noticed her fingers tightening around the cup again. "He told the town I was stealing from the collection box." "Were you?" Her eyes lifted sharply to his. No simple answer. No shaking. No hesitation. Just tired honesty. Silas believed her before realizing he already had. The rain carried the scent of wet dirt through cracks in the cabin walls. Somewhere outside, loose metal clanged against the stable again. Mercy snorted harder this time. Nervous. Silas stood slowly and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, darkness swallowed the ranch whole except for weak lantern glow spilling from the barn. But far off near the southern ridge, he noticed movement. Tiny flickers. Orange against black. Torches. Riders. Maybe half a mile out. Moving steady through the rain. Silas felt something cold settle low in his stomach. "How many know you survived?" he asked without turning around. Ayanna rose slowly from the table despite obvious pain in her ribs. "Nobody." "Then why are they riding this way?" She stepped beside him carefully and looked through the rain-streaked glass. The color drained slightly from her face. "Because they buried me near Dry Creek." Silas counted at least 6 torchlights now. Horses moving fast through mud and darkness toward the ranch. Not random travelers. Purposeful. You sure they are not just looking for shelter? He asked. Men carrying ropes never look for shelter. The words hung heavy between them. Silas looked toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace, then toward the woman standing beside him wrapped in his old wool blanket. 8 years ago, he might have saddled his horse and vanished into the mountains before trouble reached his porch. But lonely men grow strange attachments to broken things. And something about the way Ayanna stood there, exhausted but refusing to collapse, reminded him too much of himself after the war. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded once. Not fast. The torches moved closer now. Rain glimmered across them like fire bleeding through water. Silas walked calmly toward the fireplace and took down the rifle. Ayanna watched him carefully. "You believe me?" she asked quietly. Silas checked the chamber slowly before answering. "Out here, people do not bury someone alive because they are innocent of something." Thunder cracked, hard enough to shake the cabin walls. Then came the sound, faint at first beneath the storm. Dogs barking somewhere down the valley, followed by men shouting through the rain. Mercy kicked hard inside the stable. Silas blew out the lamp nearest the window immediately, throwing half the cabin into darkness. Ayanna's breathing grew shallow beside him. The torchlight stopped just beyond the fence line. 6 riders. Maybe 7. Silas could barely make out shapes through the storm, but one voice carried clearly above the rain. "Sheriff Wallace Grady." "Silas Hale," the sheriff shouted from the darkness. "You awake in there?" Silas rested one hand against the rifle stock while rainwater slid cold through cracks in the window frame. Beside him, Ayanna whispered something in Apache under her breath that sounded less like fear and more like prayer. Then Sheriff Grady shouted the next words loud enough for the entire desert to hear. "We are looking for an Apache murderer buried near Dry Creek tonight." The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls while Sheriff Wallace Grady waited beyond the fence line with 6 mounted men and enough confidence to make the desert itself feel smaller. Silas Hale stood near the darkened window with one hand resting loosely on the rifle stock, his face unreadable beneath the flickering firelight. Beside him, Ayanna barely breathed. Rainwater crawled slowly down the glass between them and the riders outside, turning the torchlight into blurred orange streaks across the night. "You know him?" Silas asked quietly without taking his eyes off the window. Ayanna nodded once. "He smiles before he lies." Outside, another horse snorted impatiently. Leather creaked. Spurs clinked softly against stirrups. Men waiting in bad weather always grew dangerous faster than men sitting in sunlight. "Silas," Sheriff Grady called again. "You planning to answer a lawman tonight?" Silas sighed softly through his nose. Lawmen usually knock first. One of the riders laughed outside, but Grady did not. That told Silas enough already. He looked toward Ayanna carefully. Her face had gone pale beneath the lantern glow, though her eyes still carried that same stubborn steadiness he noticed back at the coffin. Most people broke apart after surviving what she had survived. She looked held together by something harder than fear. "Can you stand?" he asked. "Long enough." "Good. If this goes wrong, back door leads to the stable. There is a black horse named Mercy. She bites strangers, but likes honest people." A faint breath escaped her that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It disappeared quickly. Silas opened the cabin door before the sheriff could shout again. Wind rushed inside immediately, carrying cold rain and wet dust through the room. The torchlight outside painted long shadows across the muddy yard. Sheriff Grady sat tall on a chestnut horse near the gate, broad shoulders hidden beneath a dark rain slicker. He looked like the kind of man frontier towns trusted because he spoke slowly and carried a badge polished bright enough to blind people from seeing deeper truths. The men beside him held rifles across their saddles. None smiled now. "Evening, Sheriff," Silas said calmly from the doorway. "Little late for social visits." Grady studied him carefully through the rain. "We are tracking a fugitive. At midnight. Murder does not sleep." Silas leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Neither do coyotes. Does not mean I invite them in." One rider shifted uncomfortably at that. Grady ignored it. His eyes drifted briefly past Silas toward the dark cabin interior before returning again. "You hear anything strange tonight?" the sheriff asked. "Storm mostly. No riders? No Apache woman wandering through your property?" Silas scratched slowly at the rough stubble along his jaw, as if thinking hard about it. If an Apache woman walked 20 miles through this weather, I imagine she has more grit than half your deputies. A couple men behind Grady exchanged looks. The sheriff's expression hardened slightly. This is serious, Hale. So is interrupting supper. Grady guided his horse one step closer to the porch. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of his hat. That woman murdered Reverend Doyle inside the church 3 nights ago. Silas remained quiet for a moment. You see it happen? There were witnesses. Funny. Silas glanced toward the riders behind him. I have known this town 20 years. Folks around Black Hollow can barely witness sunrise without changing the story by noon. One deputy coughed awkwardly into his fist to hide another laugh. Sheriff Grady did not appreciate it. His voice dropped lower now. Colder. You protecting her? The question lingered between thunder rolls. Silas stared back at him steadily. Frontier men respected many things. Strength, land, silence. But they feared hesitation more than bullets. Whoever blinked first usually lost. I buried enough ghosts after the war, Silas said quietly. I do not go hunting new ones in rainstorms. Grady studied him another long second. Then his eyes drifted toward the stable. Mercy kicked hard against wood inside. Once, twice. Too restless. Too loud. Silas felt the shift immediately. So did Ayanna, standing silently in the darkness behind him. The sheriff noticed the horse. Your stable seems nervous tonight. Storm bothers animals. Or strangers. One rider near the back suddenly pointed toward the muddy ground beside the porch. Sheriff. Everyone looked down. Footprints. Smaller than Silas's boots. Fresh in the mud leading toward the cabin door. The rain had not washed them away yet. Silence swallowed the yard whole. Even thunder seemed farther off suddenly. Sheriff Grady lowered his gaze slowly back toward Silas. You got company after all. Behind the sheriff, one deputy loosened the rope hanging beside his saddle. Another adjusted his rifle nervously. Silas noticed every movement. So did Ayanna from inside the cabin shadows. Careful now, Silas said quietly. You men start acting jumpy, and somebody is liable to embarrass themselves. Grady ignored the warning. Step aside, Hale. The storm wind howled across the ranch hard enough to rattle the porch lantern. Silas did not move. No warrant. This is frontier territory. Still my land. Grady's jaw tightened. You willing to die protecting an Apache killer? Silas looked out past the riders toward the endless black desert stretching behind them. Rain shimmered silver beneath the lightning flashes far away in the hills. Then he answered softly. Enough to make every man lean closer to hear it. No, but I might stand in the rain while protecting someone buried before they got a trial. The sheriff's face changed then. Just slightly. Small enough most men would miss it. But Silas caught it. Fear. Not anger. Not frustration. Fear. Real fear. Like a man watching dirt shift over something he prayed stayed buried forever. Inside the cabin, Ayanna slowly tightened her grip around the half-burned letter hidden beneath the blanket. And somewhere beyond the storm, deep past the northern ridge, a distant sound rolled faintly through the rain. Horse hooves. Many of them. If you made it this far into the story, leave a comment and hit like below. Because out on the frontier, the truth always rides in slow, but it never rides alone. The sound of approaching horses rolled through the storm like distant thunder moving across canyon walls, low at first, almost swallowed by the rain, but steady enough to make every man in Sheriff Wallace Grady's group glance nervously toward the northern ridge. Silas Hale noticed it immediately. So did the sheriff. The difference was simple. Silas listened calmly. Grady listened like a man counting ghosts. Rain dripped from the brim of the sheriff's hat while his horse shifted uneasily beneath him. You expecting visitors? Silas asked softly from the porch. Grady ignored the question. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the ranch where the sound kept growing louder. Hooves. Many of them. Not hurried. Controlled. Deputy, Grady muttered quietly beside him. How many riders you hear? The younger man swallowed hard before answering. More than us. Nobody laughed after that. Lightning flashed far off across the valley, illuminating the desert for half a heartbeat. In that brief white glare, shapes appeared along the ridge line. Riders. Tall silhouettes mounted against the storm. Then darkness swallowed them again. One deputy cursed under his breath. Another tightened his grip on the reins hard enough to make his horse toss its head nervously. Inside the cabin, Ayanna stood near the fireplace, clutching the half-burned letter beneath Silas's blanket. Her breathing had slowed. Now, though exhaustion still showed in every movement. She listened carefully to the riders approaching through the rain. Then something changed in her expression. Not fear. Recognition. "They found me," she whispered. Silas glanced back toward her over one shoulder. "Friends." Ayanna looked toward the window. "Depends who reaches us first." Outside, Sheriff Grady finally dismounted from his horse. Mud splashed beneath his boots as he stepped closer to the porch. Rainwater ran down his face, but his eyes stayed sharp and restless. "You hiding something from me, Hale?" Silas rested the rifle casually against the porch rail. "Most men out here hide something." Another lightning flash split the sky brighter this time. The riders appeared again farther down the ridge. At least 20 now, maybe more behind them, lost in darkness. No torches, no shouting, just silent movement through rain and desert wind. The kind that unsettled frontier men worse than war cries ever could. Grady saw them clearly this time. Silas watched the sheriff's face tighten. "Apache," one deputy whispered. "Too organized," another answered quietly. The riders continued descending the ridge slowly, horses stepping carefully across wet stone. Long coats moved in the storm wind. Some carried rifles across their saddles. Others carried bows wrapped against the rain. But what struck Silas most was the silence. No wasted motion. No panic. Just patience. Frontier patience. Dangerous patience. Sheriff Grady stepped closer to the porch. "If this is your doing, Hale, you better explain it fast." Silas gave a tired shrug. "Funny thing about trouble. Nobody believes it until it rides straight into their yard." One of the deputies suddenly leaned toward Grady nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should head back to town." Grady turned sharply toward him. "And tell Black Hollow we got chased off a ranch by shadows in the rain?" The deputy lowered his eyes immediately. Pride had buried more men in the West than bullets ever did. The riders finally stopped about 100 yards from the fence line. 20 horses stood perfectly still beneath the storm, their riders dark against the lightning flashes behind them. None raised a weapon. None spoke. They simply waited. Ayanna stepped carefully toward the open doorway behind Silas. When she saw the riders clearly, one slow breath escaped her chest. Relief. Real relief. "Who are they?" Silas asked quietly without looking back. "Apache scouts." Sheriff Grady heard that. His face hardened instantly. "You brought warriors to my town?" Ayanna met his gaze from the doorway. "No. You brought fear to mine." Rain hammered the ranch harder now, while thunder rolled overhead. The Apache riders remained motionless in the distance, watching. One finally guided his horse forward alone. He rode through the mud without hurry, stopping several feet beyond the gate. Older man, broad shoulders wrapped in dark leather, gray braids hanging beside weathered cheeks lined by desert years. His eyes moved first to Ayanna, then to Silas, then finally to Sheriff Grady. The old rider spoke calm English shaped by years of silence rather than weakness. "You buried the chief's daughter." Nobody moved after those words. Sheriff Grady's jaw tightened visibly. One deputy lowered his eyes toward the ground altogether. Silas slowly looked toward Ayanna beside him. "Chief's daughter." That explained the riders. The fear. The coffin. Ayanna stood straighter despite the pain in her ribs. "My father sent scouts when I did not return," she said quietly. The old Apache rider studied the sheriff now with a gaze sharp enough to cut rope. "Our people searched Dry Creek tonight." His voice remained calm. "They found disturbed earth. Empty coffin. Rope." Sheriff Grady's hand drifted unconsciously toward his belt. Silas noticed immediately. So did every Apache rider in the storm. The old scout continued slowly. "We also found Reverend Doyle's horse hidden near the canyon." The sheriff spoke fast now. Too fast. "The preacher was murdered by her. Everyone in Black Hollow knows it." "No," Ayanna said softly from the doorway. "Everyone in Black Hollow was told it." Lightning cracked overhead hard enough to shake the stable walls. Mercy kicked loudly again inside. Silas looked between them all while rain soaked the porch beneath his boots. The story felt larger now than one dead preacher or one buried woman. Something rotten moved beneath Black Hollow like water beneath cracked ice. The old Apache scout reached slowly into his coat. Several deputies immediately raised rifles halfway before Silas lifted one hand calmly. The scout pulled out a small silver cross wrapped in cloth. Reverend Doyle's cross. Silas recognized it instantly. The old man held it carefully in the rain. The preacher died protecting truth, he said. And somebody fears that truth enough to bury people beside it. Sheriff Grady's face went pale for just 1 second before anger covered it again. But Silas saw the fear underneath. Same fear he noticed earlier. The fear of a man watching secrets crawl back out of the dirt. Rain fell steady across Silas Hale's ranch while 20 Apache riders waited beyond the fence line like shadows carved from the storm itself. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody raised their voice. Yet somehow the silence felt heavier than gun smoke. Sheriff Wallace Grady stood ankle-deep in mud staring at the silver cross resting in the old Apache scout's hand. And for the first time since arriving, the sheriff looked smaller than his badge. Silas noticed it immediately. Fear changes a man's posture long before it changes his words. The old scout closed his weathered fingers carefully around the cross again. Reverend Doyle tried to protect her, he said calmly, nodding toward Ayanna standing beneath the porch light. That is why he died. That is a lie, Grady snapped too quickly. Thunder rolled low behind the hills. One of the Apache horses shook rainwater from its mane while the riders remained perfectly still. Watching, measuring, waiting. Silas leaned the rifle against the porch rail again, slow and deliberate. Funny thing about lies, he muttered quietly. They usually need shouting. Grady shot him a hard look. You want to choose sides here, Hale? Silas glanced out across the muddy yard. Looks to me like sides already got chosen before I opened my door tonight. The sheriff's deputies shifted uneasily behind him. Some avoided looking directly at the Apache riders. Others kept glancing toward the dark hills behind the ranch as if expecting more horsemen to appear any second. Frontier men understood numbers. 20 silent riders in a storm meant there were likely 50 more somewhere nobody could see. Ayanna stepped forward carefully onto the porch despite the pain still visible in her movements. Rain touched the ends of her dark hair, while wind pulled softly at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked tired beyond words, but there was something steady in her eyes now. Something returning. Reverend Doyle hid me inside the church cellar, she said quietly. He told me Sheriff Grady was stealing land deeds from Apache families near Black Hollow Creek. Several deputies exchanged startled looks immediately. Grady pointed toward her sharply. Do not listen to her. The preacher found records, Ayanna continued. He said the sheriff sold our land to railroad men in Prescott. The old Apache scout lowered his gaze slowly toward Grady. Our burial grounds were marked inside those papers. Rainwater dripped steadily from the sheriff's jaw while his breathing grew tighter. Silas watched every second of it. A man wrongly accused usually grew angry. A guilty man grew careful. You are hearing stories from frightened people, Grady said firmly. That woman is manipulating all of you. Then why bury her alive? Silas asked quietly. The question hit harder than thunder. Nobody answered right away. Not even the rain seemed loud enough to fill the silence afterward. One deputy finally shifted awkwardly in his saddle. Sheriff, Grady ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on Silas now. You think because you fought in the war you understand justice? No, Silas answered calmly. War mostly taught me how often justice gets buried by men with clean boots. Lightning flashed again across the valley, bright enough to reveal something new near the ridge behind the Apache riders. More horses, more silhouettes descending through the rain slowly. Not warriors this time. Wagons. 2 of them, covered in canvas. Sheriff Grady noticed too. What now? He muttered under his breath. The old scout glanced toward the approaching wagons without concern. Witnesses, he said simply. Silas frowned slightly. Witnesses? To what? The old man looked toward Ayanna. To the truth Reverend Doyle died protecting. The wagons rolled closer through the mud while the storm softened slightly overhead. Rain still fell, but lighter now. Enough for faces to become clearer beneath lantern glow. Silas recognized the first driver immediately. Martha Doyle, the preacher's widow. Small woman with silver hair tied beneath a dark bonnet. She rarely left town after sunset. Yet there she sat holding wagon reins steady through storm and darkness alike. Beside her rode a young Mexican stable hand from Black Hollow named Tomas. Nervous boy. Honest eyes. Sheriff Grady's expression changed the instant he saw them. They should not be here, he muttered before realizing he spoke aloud. Silas caught it. So did Ayanna. Martha Doyle climbed carefully down from the wagon when it reached the gate. Mud stained the hem of her dress, but she stood straight despite the weather. The old Apache scout stepped aside respectfully as she approached the porch. Her eyes drifted first toward Ayanna. Soft sadness crossed her face. Then she looked directly at Sheriff Grady. "Matthew warned me about you 2 months ago," she said quietly. Grady's voice hardened immediately. "Mrs. Doyle, you are upset. You do not understand what is happening." "No," she answered softly. "For the first time, I think I finally do." Tomas climbed down from the second wagon carrying a small iron lockbox against his chest. The boy looked terrified standing among deputies, Apache riders, thunder, and secrets larger than himself. Yet he kept walking until he reached the porch. "I found this beneath the church floorboards," he whispered towards Silas. "Reverend Doyle hid it before he died." Grady stepped forward instantly. "Hand that over." Nobody moved. The sheriff stopped when 20 Apache riders shifted slightly in their saddles at the same moment. Not threatening, just enough movement to remind everyone exactly how alone the sheriff suddenly was. Silas slowly took the lockbox from Tomas. Rainwater slid down the cold iron surface while thunder rumbled far off beyond the canyon country. "You know," Silas said quietly while studying the box, "storms got a funny way of digging up things people thought were buried forever." Ayanna looked toward him carefully from the porch shadows, her green eyes reflecting lantern fire and rain together. Then she whispered something almost too soft to hear. "Open it." The iron lockbox felt heavier than it should have in Silas Hale's hands, not because of its size, but because every man standing in that storm seemed suddenly afraid of what rested inside it. Rain slid down the metal edges while thunder drifted farther east across the desert. The storm was beginning to pass, but the tension around the ranch only tightened. Sheriff Wallace Grady stared at the box like a man watching his own grave being dug one shovelful at a time. "That belongs to the town office," he said sharply. Martha Doyle stepped closer through the mud before Silas could answer. "No," she said softly. "My husband hid it from the town office." Her voice carried no anger. Somehow that made it stronger. The Apache riders remained still near the fence line, horses breathing steam into the cold night air. Ayanna stood quietly beside the cabin doorway with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but Silas noticed her hands trembling slightly now. Not from fear. Exhaustion. The kind that settles deep into the bones after too many nights spent running from people who want silence more than truth. Silas turned the lockbox slowly beneath the lantern light. Rust marked the hinges, but the lock itself looked freshly scratched. Forced open once before, then sealed again in a hurry. "Anybody got a key?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Tomas finally stepped forward nervously. "Reverend Doyle gave me this 2 weeks ago." The young stable hand reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny brass key hanging from a leather cord. Rainwater glimmered along the metal. "He told me if anything happened to him." The boy swallowed hard. "I was supposed to bring it to somebody honest." Silas almost smiled at that. Then he definitely picked the wrong ranch. A faint laugh escaped Martha Doyle before disappearing into the wind. Even Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly, like she was remembering what it felt like to breathe. Normally, Sheriff Grady did not laugh. "Open that box," he demanded. "You have no authority here." Silas looked at him calmly. Funny thing about authority. It usually starts sounding nervous right before it falls apart. The sheriff stepped forward another pace, boots sinking into mud. Several deputies shifted uneasily behind him. Silas noticed something changing among them. Earlier they stood beside Grady because he wore the badge. Now they stood behind him because they were no longer sure what that badge meant. The old Apache scout watched silently from horseback while rain dripped from the brim of his weathered hat. Patience. That same dangerous patience again. Silas finally slid the brass key into the lock. The tiny click sounded louder than thunder. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed much. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside rested bundles of papers wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from water. Land deeds, church records, railroad contracts bearing official state seals from Prescott. Martha Doyle covered her mouth softly the moment she saw them. Ayanna closed her eyes for one brief second, like someone hearing a feared truth spoken aloud at last. Silas pulled out the top document carefully beneath the lantern light. "Transfer of Apache Creek Territory," he read slowly. "Signed by Sheriff Wallace Grady acting under county authority." The old Apache scout spoke quietly from his horse. That land contains our graves. Silas kept reading. More deeds. More signatures. Entire Apache family territories sold to railroad companies for almost nothing. Dates stretching back 3 years. Some signatures looked forged entirely. Others belonged to dead men. Martha Doyle's voice trembled softly beside him. Matthew found those records hidden in the church basement. Sheriff Grady's jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the rain. Those lands were legally abandoned. By families you arrested, Ayanna said quietly. Or chased away. The sheriff turned sharply toward her. You do not understand how frontier law works. No, Silas answered before she could. But I understand stealing from people too poor to fight back. Another deputy slowly removed his hat now, staring toward the mud near his boots instead of the sheriff. Frontier towns survived on trust more than laws. Once trust cracked, everything else followed. Silas dug deeper into the box until his fingers touched something smaller beneath the papers. A folded letter sealed with church wax. Reverend Doyle's handwriting stretched across the front. If this reaches daylight, tell the truth before the town buries it too. The ranch fell completely silent except for rain dripping from roof edges. Silas opened the letter carefully. The preacher's writing shook in places, as though penned in great hurry. Sheriff Grady sold sacred Apache burial land to Prescott Western Rail Company. Silas read aloud slowly. When I confronted him inside the church office, he threatened to blame the Apache woman who witnessed our conversation. Ayanna lowered her head quietly. Martha Doyle closed her eyes. Sheriff Grady suddenly looked older beneath the stormlight. Not weaker, just tired, like a man who spent too long carrying greed heavier than his own soul could hold. You do not understand, he muttered finally. The railroad was coming whether I signed or not. Nobody answered. He looked toward the deputies desperately now. That land would have been taken anyway. I made sure Black Hollow survived. One deputy finally spoke from horseback. By burying women alive, Sheriff? Grady's face hardened again instantly. I did what was necessary. Silas folded the preacher's letter slowly while cold wind drifted through the porch boards beneath his boots. That word gets men into trouble, he said quietly. Necessary. Lightning flashed one final time far beyond the hills, softer now as the storm moved east. Dawn still sat hours away, but the darkness no longer felt endless. The sheriff looked around the ranch and seemed to realize something terrible all at once. Nobody stood with him anymore. Not fully. Not after the papers. Not after the preacher's letter. Even the deputies avoided his eyes now. Out near the fence line, one Apache horse lowered its head calmly toward the wet earth while rain eased into soft drops across the valley. The old scout finally guided his horse one slow step forward. Our people came tonight expecting war, he said. But truth arrived first. Silas looked toward Ayanna then. She stood pale and exhausted beneath the porch lantern, green eyes reflecting firelight and rain together. For the first time since crawling from that coffin, she no longer looked hunted. She looked seen, and somehow that felt more powerful than every rifle on the ranch combined. Thank you for staying with this story tonight. The rain finally began to fade sometime after midnight, leaving the desert washed silver beneath broken clouds and weak lantern light. Water dripped steadily from the porch roof of Silas Hale's cabin while nobody seemed willing to move first. The truth had settled across the ranch heavier than the storm itself. Sheriff Wallace Grady stood in the mud surrounded by men who no longer looked at him the same way. That was the cruel thing about lies in frontier towns. They held power right until the moment they did not. Silas leaned against the porch rail with Reverend Doyle's letter folded carefully inside his coat pocket. The iron lockbox still rested open beside him, papers damp around the edges from rain and trembling hands. Ayanna sat quietly near the doorway now, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The blanket hung loose around her shoulders while firelight painted soft gold against the bruises along her face. She had spent days running from death only to arrive at the ranch of a man who barely spoke more than 10 words at a time. Funny how fate worked out west. Sheriff Grady slowly removed his hat and looked toward the deputies standing behind him. You boys know what happens if Prescott hears this story, he said quietly. Black Hollow disappears. Railroad money leaves. Supplies stop coming. Families starve by winter. One deputy frowned. That does not make burying innocent people right. Grady rubbed rainwater from his forehead slowly. You think frontier towns survive on right and wrong? His voice sounded tired now. They survive on hard choices. Silas looked out toward the Apache riders waiting near the fence line. Horses shifting softly. Leather creaking in the cold air. Patience again. Always patience. Funny thing. Silas muttered quietly. Every man doing ugly things eventually calls them hard choices. Martha Doyle stepped closer across the porch boards. My husband believed towns survive because decent people refuse to become monsters when life gets difficult. Grady lowered his eyes for one brief second. Guilt. Real guilt this time. But guilt arriving late rarely saved anybody. Tomas stood near the wagon holding his hat nervously against his chest. The poor boy looked like he wanted to disappear back into the storm entirely. Reverend Doyle told me the railroad men threatened the sheriff months ago, Tomas whispered carefully. He said they wanted Apache Creek before winter. The old Apache scout nodded once from horseback. Our ancestors are buried there. Silas glanced toward Ayanna. Why not fight them sooner? She lifted tired eyes toward the hills beyond the ranch. Because war burns both sides. Her voice remained soft, but steady. My father believed peace might still be possible. And you? Silas asked. Ayanna looked toward Sheriff Grady, standing in the mud beneath fading rain. Tonight, I do not know. Silence drifted across the ranch after that. Somewhere in the stable, Mercy shifted against old wood while dawn slowly threatened the eastern horizon with the faintest shade of gray. The longest nights always felt endless until the first hint of morning arrived. Then suddenly darkness looked fragile. Sheriff Grady finally stepped closer to the porch again. Slower now. Less like a lawman. More like a man carrying too much weight for too many years. You think exposing this changes anything? He asked quietly toward Silas. Railroad companies do not care about graves. Governors do not care about Apache land. Somebody else will come after me. Somebody worse. Silas studied him carefully before answering. Maybe. The sheriff frowned slightly at the simple reply. Silas continued quietly. But that does not make what you did smaller. Wind rolled softly across the wet desert grass around them. The deputies remained silent. One finally dismounted from his horse and removed the silver star pinned to his vest. He walked slowly toward Grady through the mud and handed it back without speaking. Another deputy followed. Then another. No speeches. No dramatic anger. Just men stepping away from somebody they no longer wished to become. Sheriff Grady watched it happen with hollow eyes. Frontier justice rarely arrived loudly. Most times it came quiet enough to hear your own breathing while it happened. Ayanna looked toward Silas carefully from the porch shadows. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard more than he expected. He stared out toward the dark hills for a moment before answering. 8 years ago, he said quietly, my younger brother died waiting for decent people to do something. Nobody interrupted him. Even the horses seemed stiller somehow. Town folks kept saying they did not want trouble. By the time trouble reached their own doorsteps, he shrugged faintly. There was nobody left worth saving. Ayanna watched him silently. Something softer moved behind her green eyes now. Not trust exactly, but understanding. The kind built slowly between wounded people who recognize pieces of themselves in someone else's silence. Martha Doyle stepped beside Ayanna carefully and placed one gentle hand over hers. Matthew used to say the frontier reveals who people truly are once fear arrives. Her voice trembled slightly. Tonight, I think he was right. Far beyond the ranch, the first pale streaks of dawn finally touched the mountains. Blue-gray light spread slowly across the valley floor, turning puddles silver and wet sagebrush gold along the edges. The Apache riders looked almost ghost-like beneath the early morning haze. Sheriff Grady stared toward the sunrise with exhausted eyes. What happens now? He asked softly. The old Apache scout answered first. Now truth rides back to Black Hollow. Grady closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Because deep down, every man knows the moment his own story begins slipping beyond his control. Silas looked toward the horizon where sunlight slowly pushed darkness from the desert inch by inch. He had lived alone so long he forgot what it felt like for one decision to change the direction of many lives at once. But standing there beside a hunted Apache woman, a preacher's widow, frightened deputies, and riders who chose patience over revenge, he realized something strange. The frontier was not built by guns or railroads or sheriffs. It was built by the few people stubborn enough to remain human after the world gave them every reason not to. Morning arrived slowly across the Arizona valley, pale sunlight spilling over wet desert grass and broken clouds, while Silas Hale's ranch stood quieter than it had in years. The storm was gone now, but its footprints remained everywhere. Mud along the fence line, rainwater dripping from porch boards, men standing in silence beside truths they could no longer outrun. Sheriff Wallace Grady sat alone, near the hitching post with his hat resting beside him in the mud. Nobody had tied him up. Nobody needed to. Sometimes shame held a man still better than rope ever could. The deputies stayed apart from him now, gathered near the wagons, speaking in low, uncertain voices. Frontier towns survived on reputation, and Black Hollow's sheriff had just lost his in front of Apache riders, church witnesses, and half his own men. Silas stood near the stable brushing down Mercy while the horse nudged his shoulder impatiently for oats. He preferred dealing with animals. Horses rarely lied about what they were feeling. Ayanna stepped carefully from the cabin doorway into the morning light. The bruises along her face looked softer beneath sunrise, though exhaustion still followed her movements like a shadow. She paused near the porch rail, watching the ranch quietly, watching the Apache riders, watching Silas. "You should rest," Silas said without turning around. "I rested in a coffin already." The answer caught him off guard enough to almost smile. Almost. Mercy snorted softly as if amused too. Ayanna walked slowly across the yard, boots sinking into damp earth. The old Apache scout approached her from horseback and spoke quietly in Apache. His voice carried the weight of concern mixed with relief. Ayanna listened carefully before answering in the same language. Silas could not understand the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. Family, duty, fear held tightly behind calm faces. The scout finally looked toward Silas. "Her father knows she lives," he said in careful English. "The chief waits beyond Red Mesa." Silas nodded once. "Good." The old man studied him for a moment longer. Not all white men would have opened that coffin. Silas shrugged faintly while tightening Mercy's saddle strap. Not all Apache women survive being buried. The scout almost smiled at that before guiding his horse back toward the riders. Ayanna remained standing near the stable after he left. Morning wind lifted strands of her dark hair, while sunlight touched the wet valley around them. "You really were going to bury me," she said quietly. Silas glanced toward her. "You were inside a coffin." Still rude. He gave the smallest shake of his head. "You talk more now that you are not dying." Maybe I got tired of listening to silence. The words lingered strangely between them. Silas looked away first, pretending to focus on the saddle buckle. 8 years alone had made conversation feel unfamiliar, like boots worn after too many winters forgotten in storage. Ayanna studied him quietly for a moment. "You carry sadness like old soldiers carry scars," she said softly. "After enough years, they stop noticing the weight." Silas tightened the strap harder than necessary. "People spend too much time trying to notice me already. And yet you stayed." He finally looked at her then. Green eyes. Steady. No fear left in them now. Just tired honesty. Funny how quickly strangers could begin sounding familiar after surviving one terrible night together. Before Silas could answer, voices rose sharply near the porch. One of the deputies had opened more papers from the lockbox and now stared at them in disbelief. "These signatures go all the way to Prescott," the deputy muttered. "Judges too." Martha Doyle lowered herself slowly into one of the porch chairs, looking suddenly much older than the night before. "Matthew said the railroad reached farther than anyone understood." Sheriff Grady lifted tired eyes toward the papers. "You think exposing me changes that?" Nobody answered immediately because deep down everyone knew he might be partly right. The frontier was changing. Railroads, land offices, mining companies. Men in expensive coats making decisions about places they had never walked beneath summer heat or winter dust. Black Hollow was only one small town standing in the path of something larger than all of them. Ayanna stepped closer to the porch. "Maybe the railroad still comes," she said quietly. "But at least now people know what was buried beneath it." Martha Doyle looked toward her carefully. "My husband believed truth matters even when it loses." Ayanna nodded slowly. "My father says truth loses only when fear survives longer." The two women held each other's gaze for a moment. Different worlds. Different histories. Yet grief sounded strangely similar in every language. One deputy suddenly approached Silas near the stable. Younger man. Nervous eyes. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, What happens now? Silas brushed dirt from his hands slowly before answering. Guess you boys ride back to town. And the sheriff? Silas glanced toward Grady, sitting alone in the mud. Morning sunlight finally reached him fully now, exposing every tired line on his face. He no longer looked powerful, just human. That part belongs to Black Hollow, Silas answered softly. The deputy nodded uneasily. Frontier justice always sounded simpler before it arrived at your doorstep, wearing familiar faces. Ayanna looked toward the distant hills beyond the ranch where sunlight spread wider across Red Mesa. I should leave before noon, she said quietly. Silas focused carefully on adjusting Mercy's saddle, though it no longer needed adjusting. Probably. My father will want to thank you. I am not good around chiefs. You are not good around anybody. That finally pulled a real laugh from him. Brief, rough, rusted from lack of use, but real enough to surprise both of them. Ayanna smiled faintly after hearing it, and for one strange second the ranch did not feel haunted anymore. Just lonely. There was a difference. Wind rolled softly through the cottonwood tree beside the cabin, while Apache riders prepared their horses near the fence line. The world was moving again. Toward town. Toward judgment. Toward whatever waited beyond the desert horizon. But Silas suddenly realized something unsettling. After years spent hiding from people, he was not ready for her to leave. By late morning, the desert had turned gold beneath the Arizona sun, the storm already fading into memory like most hard nights eventually do. Steam rose slowly from wet fence posts around Silas Hale's ranch, while horses drank from shallow puddles left behind in the yard. The Apache riders were preparing to leave now, tightening saddle straps and checking supplies with the quiet efficiency of people used to surviving difficult land. Nobody wasted movement. Nobody wasted words. Out on the frontier, silence often carried more respect than conversation ever could. Silas stood beside the stable doorway, sharpening a small skinning knife against smooth stone, mostly to keep his hands busy. He had spent years building a life where nothing unexpected remained long enough to matter. Then one rainstorm dropped an Apache chief's daughter into a coffin beside his property and somehow turned his ranch into the center of every buried secret in Black Hollow. Funny how quickly loneliness could disappear once trouble arrived. Ayanna emerged from the cabin carrying Reverend Doyle's lockbox wrapped carefully in cloth. She moved slower than before, but stronger too. The color had returned to her face beneath the morning light. Martha Doyle followed behind her with a small leather satchel filled with bread, dried meat, and medicine. You still need rest, Martha said gently while pressing the satchel into Ayanna's hands. My people are waiting. That does not stop your ribs from hurting. Ayanna gave the older woman a soft look filled with something close to gratitude. You sound like my grandmother. Martha smiled faintly. That means I am old enough to be ignored. Even Silas looked up at that. Ayanna almost laughed again before the sound faded into quiet. It surprised Silas how much he noticed her expressions now. The way she hid pain behind calm eyes. The way she scanned open land every few seconds out of habit. The way silence seemed natural around her instead of awkward. Some people entered a room loudly. Others settled into your thoughts before you realized. The space had changed. Sheriff Wallace Grady remained seated near the hitching post beneath guard from 2 deputies. He had barely spoken for over an hour. The sun exposed him differently than the storm had. Smaller somehow. Less dangerous. Like daylight itself stripped away the authority fear once gave him. One deputy approached Silas near the stable. Town council wants Grady brought back before dark, he said quietly. Silas nodded once. Probably wise. People in Black Hollow are already talking. People always talk. The deputy glanced toward Ayanna near the porch. Not usually about buried Apache women climbing out of coffins. Fair point. Silas slid the knife back into its sheath slowly. Across the yard, the old Apache scout mounted his horse and called something softly toward Ayanna in Apache. She answered without turning around. Then she looked toward Silas. My father wants to meet you. Silas frowned immediately. That sounds dangerous. Only if you insult his horse. I insult most horses. Ayanna tilted her head slightly. Then perhaps do not speak. He looked away before she noticed the corner of his mouth, trying to smile again. The woman had somehow learned how to pull humor from a man who barely remembered owning any. That alone felt suspicious. Martha Doyle stepped beside Silas while watching the Apache riders gather near the fence line. Matthew used to say God sends strangers into our lives to show us who we have become. Silas adjusted Mercy's saddle blanket without answering. Martha glanced toward him knowingly. You do not have to pretend indifference around me. I am not pretending anything. You have looked toward that woman every 30 seconds since sunrise. Silas cleared his throat roughly. I look toward everybody every 30 seconds. No, Martha said softly. Only the ones you fear losing. That hit harder than he expected. He stared toward the open desert beyond the ranch where sunlight shimmered across distant canyon stone. Fear losing her. Strange thought for a man who barely knew her name yesterday. Yet the feeling settled quietly into his chest anyway. Frontier life made attachments dangerous because tomorrow was never promised. Maybe that was exactly why people held on to them when they appeared. Ayanna approached him slowly while tying the medicine satchel behind her saddle. You never told me why you live alone out here, she said. Silas rested both hands against the fence rail. Same reason most lonely men do. Which is, at some point they stop believing the world feels safer with them inside it. Wind moved softly through the cottonwood branches overhead. Ayanna studied him carefully before answering. My people believe wounded wolves leave the pack because they fear becoming a burden. Silas looked toward her. And the pack usually suffers more without them. Their eyes held for a moment longer than either expected. No dramatic words. No promises. Just understanding. Real understanding. The kind loneliness recognizes when it finally meets another loneliness shaped differently, but carrying the same weight. A distant rider suddenly appeared near the southern ridge, moving fast toward the ranch. Dust kicked behind the horse despite the wet ground. Every Apache scout noticed immediately. So did the deputies. Hands drifted toward rifles out of instinct more than threat. The rider reached the fence line, breathing hard beneath a sweat-soaked hat. Young ranch hand from Black Hollow. Barely 19. Panic filled his face before he even spoke. Mr. Hale, he called out breathlessly. Railroad men arrived in town an hour ago. Sheriff Grady finally lifted his head sharply after hearing that. The young rider swallowed hard. They brought armed guards from Prescott. Silence spread across the ranch again. Different this time. Heavier. The old Apache scout guided his horse closer slowly. Why? The ranch hand looked toward Ayanna nervously. Because somebody told them the land papers were found. Sheriff Grady closed his eyes briefly, like a man watching the future collapse exactly the way he feared it would. I warned you, he muttered quietly. Silas stared toward the southern horizon, where Black Hollow rested miles away beneath rising heat waves and railroad greed. Trouble was moving again. Faster now. Bigger. And for the first time in years, he realized he was no longer standing outside it looking in. The heat of late afternoon settled heavy across the valley as Silas Hale rode beside Ayanna toward Black Hollow, with dust rising beneath Mercy's hooves in long golden trails. Behind them followed Martha Doyle in the wagon carrying Reverend Doyle's lockbox wrapped beneath canvas, while two former deputies rode quietly at her side, no longer wearing silver stars on their vests. Farther back, the Apache scouts moved through the desert hills, almost invisible against the rocks and sagebrush. They never rode directly on the road. Men who survived frontier wars learned long ago that staying seen too long usually got you buried. The closer they came to town, the quieter everyone became. Black Hollow appeared slowly through the shimmering heat ahead. Wooden rooftops crouched beneath the Arizona sun, like tired animals waiting for trouble. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Horses stood tied outside the saloon. But something felt wrong immediately. Too many strangers. Too many wagons painted with Prescott Western Rail Company markings lined beside the main street. Men in dark coats stood near the town office carrying polished rifles and expensive boots that looked out of place in frontier dust. Railroad men. Silas hated them on sight. Railroad men always smelled faintly of money and distance, like people who believed land existed only on paper instead of beneath real feet and real graves. Ayanna slowed her horse beside him. They came quickly. Men protecting stolen things usually do. The wagon wheels creaked softly behind them, while townspeople slowly began noticing their arrival. Conversations faded. Faces turned. Silas saw confusion spread first when people noticed Martha Doyle carrying the lockbox. Then came shock when they saw Sheriff Grady riding under escort beside the wagon instead of leading it. But the moment Ayanna rode into view beside Silas, silence swallowed the entire street. A buried Apache woman returning alive had a way of changing the mood in town. One little boy near the barber shop dropped his wooden toy horse straight into the dirt. Nobody picked it up. Silas guided Mercy forward calmly through the silence. The old saloon. Piano stopped playing halfway through a note. Even the wind seemed to hold still between buildings. Then one of the railroad men stepped off the boardwalk near the town office. Tall, thin, gray suit despite the heat. Silver watch chain hanging across his vest like he wanted people noticing how expensive time looked on him. Sheriff Grady. The man called sharply. What exactly is the meaning of this? Grady said nothing. He looked tired beyond words now. The railroad man's eyes shifted toward Ayanna next. Disgust flashed across his face fast enough most people would miss it. Silas did not. Interesting company you keep, the man muttered. Name's Silas Hale, Silas answered calmly. And I already dislike yours. Several townspeople exchanged nervous glances at that. The railroad man stepped closer, boots perfectly clean despite the dust around him. Edwin Mercer, he said coldly. Regional representative for Prescott Western Rail. That sounds like a job invented by people afraid of real work. One of Mercer's guards smirked before catching himself quickly. Mercer ignored the insult. Men like him survived by pretending insults floated beneath their importance. Sheriff, Mercer continued sharply. I assume you recovered the stolen documents. Martha Doyle climbed carefully down from the wagon before Grady could answer. No, she said quietly. We recovered the truth. Murmurs spread instantly through the street. Townspeople began stepping from storefronts now. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, families. Black Hollow had spent years whispering fears behind closed doors. Now those whispers were standing in sunlight holding proof. Mercer's expression tightened when he noticed the growing crowd. This is private railroad business. No, Ayanna said softly while dismounting beside Silas. This is stolen Apache land. Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably hearing her speak so calmly. Others looked ashamed for reasons they probably could not explain even to themselves. Sheriff Grady finally removed his hat slowly beneath the afternoon sun. The papers are real, he admitted quietly. Gasps moved through the street like sudden wind. Mercer turned sharply toward him. Careful what you say. I have been careful too long already. Silas watched the moment happen clearly. The exact second fear stopped controlling Sheriff Grady. The man looked exhausted, broken even, but lighter somehow. Like confession removed weight pride could never carry forever. Mercer's voice hardened instantly. You signed legal transfers under state authority. By threatening people, Martha Doyle answered. And hiding burial records. Mercer looked toward the crowd gathering wider around the street. His polished calm began cracking now. You people do not understand what this railroad brings. Jobs. Supplies. Growth. Growth built on graves, Ayanna said quietly. The silence afterward cut deeper than shouting ever could. A little girl standing beside the general store slowly reached for her mother's hand. One older rancher removed his hat while looking toward Ayanna with something close to regret. Frontier towns rarely changed in one moment. But sometimes a single truth cracked enough stone for sunlight to finally reach inside. Mercer stepped closer toward Silas now, lowering his voice. You really want to stand against a railroad company? Silas looked around Black Hollow slowly. Dust drifting through sunlight. Nervous townspeople. Martha Doyle clutching the lockbox. Ayanna standing tall despite bruises and exhaustion. The sheriff staring toward the church steeple like a man seeing it honestly for the first time in years. No, Silas answered quietly. I just got tired of standing beside cowards. Mercer's face hardened completely after that. He turned sharply toward his guards. Take the box. Nobody moved. Not the guards. Not the townspeople. Because somewhere beyond the ridge outside town, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of many horses approaching through canyon wind. The sound of approaching horses rolled across Black Hollow like distant thunder drifting through canyon stone, low and steady enough to pull every eye toward the western ridge beyond town. Dust rose there beneath the afternoon sun in long pale clouds. Edwin Mercer stopped speaking immediately. So did his guards. People along the boardwalks stepped into the street slowly, squinting against the heat as the riders finally appeared between the hills. There were many more than before. Not 20. Not 50. Nearly 100 Apache riders moved together across the desert with calm precision, horses gliding through sunlight and dust without hurry. No war cries, no rifles raised, just silence. That silence unsettled the railroad men worse than shouting ever could. Silas Hale rested one hand loosely near Mercy's saddle horn while watching the riders descend toward town. Beside him, Ayanna stood perfectly still, green eyes fixed on the front rider emerging through the dust cloud. Older man, broad shoulders despite age, gray braids hanging over dark leather decorated with faded turquoise beads. The Apache chief, her father. The townspeople of Black Hollow watched him approach with nervous faces shaped by years of rumors and fear. But the old chief carried himself without anger, without pride even, just dignity, the kind impossible to fake. Sheriff Wallace Grady lowered his eyes toward the dirt as the chief rode past him slowly. Edwin Mercer stepped forward sharply instead. "This town is under railroad authority," he announced loudly. "You people have no right entering armed." The chief guided his horse to a stop in the center of town and studied Mercer for one long, quiet moment before speaking. "Our people buried their dead on this land before your railroad learned how to spell Arizona." A few townspeople exchanged uncomfortable looks after hearing that. Mercer straightened his expensive coat stiffly. "Your claims are not recognized by the state. Neither is decency, apparently." Silas muttered the words just loud enough for nearby ranchers to hear. One of them smothered a laugh behind his hand before noticing Mercer glaring toward him. Ayanna stepped slowly toward her father. The old chief dismounted without another word and placed both hands gently against her shoulders as if making certain she was truly alive. No dramatic embrace, no tears, just silence filled with relief deeper than words. The chief looked carefully at the bruises along her face, then toward Sheriff Grady, then toward Mercer. Nobody needed translation for the sadness in his eyes. "You buried my daughter," he said quietly. Grady swallowed hard. But the words died there. Some truths leave men with nothing useful left to say. Martha Doyle climbed carefully onto the boardwalk beside the church, carrying Reverend Doyle's lockbox against her chest. "The whole town deserves to hear this," she announced softly. More people gathered immediately. Farmers, shopkeepers, miners, wives holding children close beside them. Black Hollow had spent years pretending certain things stayed invisible if nobody spoke about them openly. But silence becomes difficult once truth rides directly through your streets beneath broad daylight. Mercer stepped toward Martha sharply. "Those papers belong to Prescott Western Rail." "No," Sheriff Grady said suddenly. Every head turned toward him. The sheriff looked older than ever standing there beneath the afternoon sun. Smaller too, like guilt had finally carved pieces from him nobody could replace. "They belong to the Apache families whose land I helped steal." A stunned silence swept through town. Even Mercer looked briefly caught off guard. Grady removed the silver star from his vest slowly. "I told myself the railroad would save Black Hollow." His voice trembled slightly now. "I told myself sacrifices had to be made." The old Apache chief watched him quietly without interruption. Grady lowered his eyes toward the dust beneath his boots. "Truth is," he exhaled slowly, "I got greedy before I got scared." Nobody moved after that confession. The frontier sun hung low above town now, casting long shadows across storefronts and wagon wheels. Somewhere nearby a screen door creaked softly in the wind. Mercer finally stepped forward again, face cold with anger. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped. "The railroad still owns those contracts. Signed through fraud." Martha Doyle answered firmly. "And witnessed by a dead preacher." Mercer shot back. Ayanna stepped beside Silas calmly. Not dead enough to stay silent. Several townspeople nodded quietly after hearing that. The mood in Black Hollow had changed completely now. Fear was still there, but no longer pointing in the same direction. Mercer noticed it too. His guards shifted uneasily behind him as more ranchers stepped away from the railroad men instead of toward them. Even the saloon owner crossed his arms and frowned toward Mercer openly. Frontier towns survived on trust, and trust had begun slipping away from the railroad company inch by inch. The old Apache chief looked across Black Hollow slowly. At the church, the schoolhouse, the dusty street where children now watched silently from behind their mothers' skirts. "My people do not want war," he said quietly. "We want the graves of our ancestors left in peace." One little girl near the barber shop looked up toward her father. "Why would somebody build train tracks over graves?" she whispered. The father had no answer, because children often ask the questions adults spend years trying to avoid. Mercer glanced around town and seemed to realize he was losing control of the room despite standing outdoors. He pointed sharply toward the lockbox. Those documents are property of Prescott Western Rail Company, and I will retrieve them one way or another. Silas finally stepped forward then. Slow, calm, dangerous in the way quiet men become once they stop fearing consequences. You know what I think? He asked softly. Mercer frowned. I do not particularly care. I think men like you mistake patience for weakness. Wind moved through the street carrying dust and heat around them, while Apache riders waited silently near the edge of town. Mercer stared hard at Silas. You threatening me? Silas shook his head once. No. Then he glanced toward the old Apache chief, Martha Doyle, the townspeople slowly gathering closer together, and finally Ayanna standing beside him beneath the fading sunlight. Just explaining something your kind never understood about the frontier. Mercer narrowed his eyes. Silas's voice stayed low and steady. Land remembers who loved it, long after it forgets who tried to buy it. The desert sun dipped lower over Black Hollow, turning the windows of the town into sheets of burning gold, while silence stretched across the main street like a drawn wire ready to snap. Nobody moved after Silas Hale's words. Even the horses seemed still. Beneath the evening heat, Edwin Mercer stood in the center of town with dust clinging to his polished boots for the first time all day, and somehow that tiny detail pleased Silas more than it should have. Men like Mercer hated looking touched by the places they tried to own. The railroad representative glanced around slowly at the faces surrounding him. Ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, families, Apache riders waiting at the edge of town beneath the fading sunlight. The mood had changed completely now. Not loud, not angry, just awake. And awakened towns were dangerous to men built on secrets. Mercer straightened his coat carefully like he still believed appearance could hold authority together. You people are making a mistake, he announced sharply. Prescott Western Rail brings prosperity. Schools, jobs, protection. Protection from who? Martha Doyle asked quietly from the church steps. The people already living here? Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Mercer's jaw tightened. This territory was dying before the railroad arrived. The old Apache chief finally stepped forward then, moving with calm slowness through the dusty street. He looked toward the buildings around him. The saloon, the church, the general store, then toward the distant hills beyond town where the evening light touched the desert red and copper. Land is not dying because it stays quiet, he said softly. Only frightened men believe silence means emptiness. A few older ranchers lowered their eyes after hearing that, because deep down, most frontier people understood exactly what he meant. The desert had never been empty. People simply refused to listen long enough to hear it breathing. Sheriff Wallace Grady stood beside the hitching post staring toward the church bell tower. The silver badge rested forgotten in his hand now, no longer shining. Just metal. I thought I was saving the town, he muttered quietly. Silas looked toward him. Maybe you were trying to save yourself from becoming small. Grady gave a tired laugh with no humor inside it. Too late for that. Ayanna stepped beside her father beneath the fading sunlight. The bruises along her face had softened into shadows now, though. The memory behind them still remained sharp in every eye watching her. She looked toward the townspeople carefully before speaking. My people did not ride here for revenge. Her voice stayed calm, steady. We came because graves should not need defending. A long silence followed those words. Then something unexpected happened. Old Ben Calloway, owner of the feed store and one of the oldest men in Black Hollow, slowly removed his hat and stepped into the street. My wife is buried east of town, he said roughly. If somebody tried building tracks over her grave, he swallowed hard. I reckon I would fight like hell too. Nobody laughed at the old rancher's language, because everybody understood him. One by one, other townspeople began stepping forward. Quietly, a blacksmith, a schoolteacher, two miners still covered in dust from the hills. They did not move toward the Apache riders with fear anymore. They moved toward truth because once fear cracked open, shame usually followed close behind. Mercer saw it happening. Panic flickered behind his polished calm for the first time all day. You people think sentiment changes ownership? He snapped. The railroad has contracts recognized by the governor himself. Martha Doyle lifted Reverend Doyle's letter gently from the lockbox. Contracts signed through lies. Still legal. So was burying innocent people? Silence struck the street again. Mercer looked toward his armed guards sharply. Enough of this. But the guards hesitated now. One glanced toward the Apache riders watching silently from the edge of town. Another looked toward the growing crowd standing behind Martha Doyle and Silas instead of behind Mercer. Frontier men understood something railroad men never fully learned. Numbers mattered less than conviction. And Mercer suddenly stood surrounded by people who no longer believed him. The evening wind rolled through Black Hollow carrying dust, sagebrush, and distant thunder from mountains far away. Ayanna looked toward Silas quietly. This is the moment when men usually choose violence. Silas rested one hand against Mercy's neck thoughtfully. Yeah. What happens if they do? He studied the town around him. Nervous faces. Frightened guards. The old Apache chief standing beneath the sunset like part of the desert itself. Sheriff Grady broken by his own guilt. Martha Doyle holding truth in weathered hands. Then finally Ayanna beside him, alive because one lonely rancher opened a coffin instead of burying it. Then we remind them they still have another choice. Her green eyes held his for one silent second longer than necessary. Strange how trust could grow between two people who met in darkness and dirt. Mercer suddenly pointed toward the lockbox again. That evidence disappears tonight, he said coldly. Or this town loses every railroad contract promised to it. Nobody answered immediately. Then Sheriff Grady slowly walked into the center of the street, holding his silver badge. The whole town watched him. He looked toward Mercer with exhausted eyes finally emptied of fear. Maybe that is the first honest thing to happen here in years. Mercer frowned. What? Grady turned toward the crowd. You all deserve to hear this. His voice carried farther now. Stronger somehow. The railroad never planned to stop at Apache Creek. Uneasy murmurs spread instantly. Grady pointed toward the northern ridge beyond town. Once tracks crossed the burial grounds, they planned to seize ranch land next. Water rights after that. Faces changed around the street. Shock first. Then anger. Real anger. Mercer stepped toward him sharply. Careful. But Grady no longer looked afraid. That is why they paid me. Silence swallowed Black Hollow whole. Because suddenly everybody understood the truth at once. The Apache land was only the beginning. Mercer realized too late that the town had stopped seeing the Apache riders as outsiders. Now they saw them as the first warning. A little boy near the barber shop slowly picked his wooden toy horse back up from the dirt and looked toward his father. Does this mean the Apache people were telling the truth the whole time? The father stared toward Ayanna and the old chief beneath the setting sun before answering quietly. Yes, son. Then he lowered his eyes with shame. Looks like they were. The sun disappeared behind the western hills while the last light of evening stretched long across Black Hollow, painting the dusty street in gold and shadow. Nobody spoke for a while after the truth settled over town. Not because people lacked words, but because some moments arrived too heavy for language at first. Edwin Mercer stood alone now near the railroad wagons, his polished confidence cracked beyond repair beneath the eyes of the very people he once believed he could control. The armed guards beside him lowered their rifles slowly one by one, less out of fear and more from realizing nobody around them wished to keep pretending anymore. Frontier towns changed slowly, then suddenly all at once. Sheriff Wallace Grady walked toward the church steps, where Martha Doyle still held Reverend Doyle's letter against her chest. The old sheriff looked worn thin by regret, like years had finally caught him in a single afternoon. He stopped before Martha and removed his hat quietly. I cannot undo what I did, he said softly. No, Martha answered. But you can stop hiding from it. Grady nodded once. A small movement. Honest. Maybe the first truly honest thing he had done in years. Two former deputies stepped beside him afterward, not to arrest him, not to shame him, but simply to stand there while he faced what came next. That was the strange thing about justice in the frontier. Sometimes it arrived with chains. Other times it arrived with witnesses. The old Apache chief looked toward the gathered townspeople beneath the fading sunset. My people will return to Red Mesa tonight, he said calmly. We ask only that the graves remain untouched. Old Ben Calloway removed his hat again slowly. Then another rancher followed. Then another. Until half the men in town stood bareheaded beneath the evening wind. Not surrender. Respect. Ayanna watched it happen quietly beside Silas Hale. Her green eyes reflected the last sunlight resting across Black Hollow, and for the first time since crawling from that coffin, the tightness in her shoulders finally eased. The town no longer looked at her like a threat. They looked at her like a human being. Funny how difficult that simple thing had become out west. Mercer stepped toward his wagon stiffly. "This is not over," he muttered coldly. "The railroad will send lawyers." "Then send them," Martha Doyle answered. "But this town finally knows what side it stands on." Mercer looked around, once more hoping to find support somewhere in the crowd. He found none. Even the saloon owner turned away from him entirely. Frontier people could forgive many things. Fear, mistakes, pride. But they rarely forgave outsiders trying to turn them against their own land. Mercer climbed into his wagon without another word. The railroad guards followed behind him in silence while the horses pulled the wagons slowly back toward the southern trail. Nobody cheered watching them leave. Victory out west rarely sounded loud. Most times it sounded like exhausted people breathing again after holding fear too long. Twilight settled over Black Hollow while lanterns slowly flickered alive inside windows along the street. The Apache riders began turning their horses toward Red Mesa. The old chief approached Silas one final time beneath the deepening blue sky. "You opened the coffin," he said quietly. Silas rubbed one rough hand against the back of his neck. Seemed rude not to. The chief almost smiled. Almost. Then he removed a small silver pendant from beneath his coat and placed it into Silas's palm. Carved into the metal was the shape of a hawk with wings spread wide against the wind. "My grandfather carried this during the long winter migration," the chief said. "Now you carry it." Silas looked down at the pendant resting in his weathered hand. "I do not deserve this." Deserving is not the same as earning. The old chief placed one hand briefly against Silas's shoulder before returning to his horse. No speeches, no dramatic gratitude. Just quiet respect between two men shaped by different worlds and the same hard land. Ayanna remained standing beside Silas after the riders began moving out of town. Wind drifted softly through the street carrying the smell of dust, horses, and cooling earth. Somewhere far away a coyote cried into the coming night. "You should go with them," Silas said quietly, though the words felt heavier than expected. Ayanna studied him carefully. "Is that what you want?" He looked toward the empty road leading back to his lonely ranch. 8 years of silence waited there for him. 8 years of waking alone beneath the same cottonwood tree with nothing except horses and ghosts for company. Strange how quickly loneliness could become unbearable once somebody finally interrupted it. "I stopped knowing what I wanted a long time ago," he admitted softly. Ayanna stepped closer then, close enough for him to see the faint scar near her left eyebrow. Close enough to smell desert sage lingering in her dark hair beneath the cold evening wind. "My father says some people spend their whole lives standing outside their own hearts because they are afraid of losing what waits inside." Silas gave a tired half-smile. "Your father sounds exhausting." This time she really laughed. Soft, brief, beautiful enough to make the entire dusty street feel warmer somehow. Then she reached into her coat and pressed something gently into his hand beside the silver hawk pendant. The half-burned letter Reverend Doyle had died protecting. "Why give me this?" Silas asked quietly. "Because you are the first man who looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem." The words settled deep inside him where old grief still lived. Around them, Black Hollow slowly returned to life. Shopkeepers reopening doors. Lanterns glowing through saloon windows. Children chasing each other through dust again now that fear had loosened its grip on the town. Ayanna glanced toward the Apache riders waiting near the edge of town. "I have to leave before full dark." Silas nodded once, even though every part of him suddenly hated the idea. She turned to walk away, then paused after only 2 steps. "There is one thing my people believe about the desert," she said softly without looking back. "What is that?" The evening wind lifted gently through the street while stars slowly appeared above the Arizona hills. Ayanna finally glanced back toward him over her shoulder, green eyes shining beneath lantern light and twilight together. "The land remembers kindness longer than men remember fear." Then she mounted her horse and rode slowly toward the waiting Apache riders. Beneath the deepening night sky, Silas stood there long after they disappeared beyond the western ridge, the silver hawk pendant resting warm in his hand, while Black Hollow breathed quietly behind him. And somewhere deep beneath the endless frontier stars, A lonely rancher finally understood something the desert had been trying to teach him all along. Out here, justice did not arrive through bullets or badges or railroad money. It arrived through the stubborn courage of people willing to remain human after the world gave them every reason not to. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.